very thankful for Victoria's help the last couple weeks. It's been a pleasure to see her and have her minister to us through worship. And I know she's getting ready to graduate pretty soon, so that's exciting. But we will miss her, that's for sure. So, good morning. Good morning. Today, we're going to be continuing the series of a journey through Acts. We're going to be in the book of Acts. And with that, today we're going to be talking about the title, Convinced, is the title today. Convinced. What does it mean to be convinced? Well, convinced is to make someone agree, understand, or realize the truth or validity of something or persuade. Okay. There's the scripture says, "For I am persuaded that neither death nor life nor basically anything can separate us from the love of Christ." Right? Paraphrased. That's basically what it means. And so, convinced. You know, we need to read the Word of God in a way that we are seeking the truth. And when we seek the truth, we'll find it if we seek it with all of our hearts. Knock and the door will be open, seek and you shall find. You know, I believe as we seek God, we can be convinced of the truth of God. You know, there's a lot of things that try to persuade us, isn't there? There's a lot of things in life that tries to persuade us, our thinking. Sometimes we can question motives, we can question the truth as we know it, all those things. But when it comes down to it, there's one truth. You know that? You know there's not multiple truths. There's one. That's it. So truth is not relative to what we believe. Truth is true. He is truth. God is truth. And the truth will set us free. There's freedom in Jesus. There's freedom in the Word of God. So, I'm going to read for you in Acts chapter 9, and I'm going to start in verse 32. It says here, "Meanwhile, Peter traveled from place to place, and he came down to visit the believers in the town of Lydia. There he met a man named Aeneas, who had been paralyzed and bedridden for 8 years. Peter said to him, 'Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up, roll up your sleeping mat.' And he was healed instantly. Then the whole population of Lydda and Sharon saw Aeneas walking around, and they turned to the Lord." So, when we read this passage, my point today, my first point is, when people realize what God can do, it can change them. Right? When people realize what God can do, it can change them. I remember as a little boy encountering the power of God in different ways. And I still do. God is still at work. God is still a miracle worker, right? He's still the way maker, you know. You know that song, but it's more than a song. It's true. So, when people realize what God can do, it can change their perspective. It can change their understanding. It can help them realize the truth, right? It can persuade them to believe, right? You know, many times when the apostles would go around, just like Peter did at this moment, people would be healed. And some of those people were other people's best friends. Some of those people were other people's family members. Some of those people were other people's acquaintances. And they knew that those people had these issues and that God healed them. Right? They knew that. And because they knew that it had to have been something that changed their circumstances and changed who they were and what happened to them, they knew that God had to intervene. And because of that, when they realized what God can do, it changed them. And that's what happened when Peter healed Aeneas and Lydda. God began to show the people in that area what he could do, and it changed their perspective. It changed their idea of what God could do, and they began to realize not only can God do great things, but he's done great things, and he did it to someone that they knew. He gave hope. You see, and this is amazing to me that it said this. Now, sometimes when you read the Bible, it gets you thinking, right? When I read this, it said, then the whole population of Lydda and Sharon saw Aeneas walking around, and they turned to the Lord. It said the whole population. Now, I don't know if that means every single person, but it was pretty close, if not. How awesome would that be if something happened in Springfield, Missouri, and everybody came to the Lord? Everyone. That'd do some change, wouldn't it? That'd make a difference, wouldn't it? Wow. To me, that's just amazing. But many times, things happen that God does, and we're just not paying attention. We need to pay attention so that God can give us the truth, so that we can understand what he's done, so that it can be validated in our minds, right? And so that it can persuade us to trust in the truth. Trust in God. Okay? So, I'm going to read here in Acts 9:36, as we continue reading in verse 36, it says, there was a believer in Joppa named Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. If I was Tabitha, I'd say, why don't you just forget about the Greek? I mean, are you with me? I'd say, just call me Tabitha. I don't want to be Dorcas. I don't know. I think people's probably called me Dorcas before. Usually it was probably my sisters or but either way, I wouldn't want to be called Dorcas. So, I really don't want to be called Tabitha either, but so, she was always doing kind things for others and helping the poor. About this time, she became ill and died. Her body was washed for burial and laid in an upstairs room. But the believers had heard that Peter was nearby at Lydda. So they sent 2 men to beg him. Hey, are you good at begging? Okay, go. I don't know if they're just, I don't know if they cast lots to figure out who's going, or they're like, you know what, you're good at getting your way. Why don't you go? I don't know how that worked, but either way, they picked 2 people, and they went to basically beg Peter to come. And they said, please come as soon as possible. Guys, she was dead. She was dead. And they said, please come as soon as possible. Well, in today's time, we think, well, it's already too late. She dead. Okay? So, at that point, in our minds today, we think it's already too late. We should have sent for him when she was sick. But now she's dead. Well, guess what? They didn't think it was too late. And they sent for Peter. And they said, please come as soon as possible. So Peter returned with them. And as soon as he arrived, they took him to the upstairs room. The room was filled with widows who were weeping and showing him the coats and other clothes Dorcas had made for them. Okay? Now, the second point today is that when we care, it can persuade others to care. Would you agree? Have you ever had somebody that just went an extra step, an extra mile to help you, and you're like, you know what, if they ever need help, I'm going to help them too. Right? You know, the hard thing for me as a pastor is when I can't help. That's tough. Sometimes I get overwhelmed, and I tell God sometimes, I've told him, and I'm going to be transparent with you, I told God, if I can't help the people, if you don't give me the resources to help them, I don't want to do this. Because sometimes people may think I don't care just because I can't help them. But that's not true. It's not the truth. It may feel like that at the time. But we only have what we have, and we can only do what we can do. But what we do have, we need to use for God's glory and God's honor. So, when we care, it can persuade others to care. You see, these people knew that Dorcas cared. They knew that she went out of her way when many other people probably would just pass by them and maybe make fun of them. But she would stop and take her time to see their needs and try to meet their needs. She would make clothing for them. She would do whatever the resources she had, she would try to use them to help people. Now, I'm sure that there were people that she couldn't help, but the ones that she could, she did. Right? And because of that, even after she died, people cared for her too. You know, it amazes me sometimes when I go to funerals or I preach funerals of people that you knew had such a caring heart. Because it's in those times where people are just like, you know what, whatever I can do at this moment to help, I'll do it. Because they would have done the same for me. Right? Now you can also tell the funerals when the person that passed didn't really care much about other people. I mean, it's true. And I've heard people talking, I mean, hey, you think people don't talk when there's visitation? Yeah, they're visiting. Well, you know, you just know how they were. Right? You know how they were. They didn't really care much. They didn't really care much for me. I've heard people say that. Well, he didn't really care much for me. I don't even really know why I'm here. You know, that may not have been true. Or it may have been true. But here's what I know. If you care enough, people will see that. And they'll care about you. These people cared so much for Tabitha, or Dorcas, whichever one you want to call her, I guess. She cared so much that they chose to not take her death as the end. They said, you know what? Peter's just right over here. How awesome would it be if Dorcas kept living? Right? Because, you know, they knew that if she continued to live, then she was going to help people, and them too, because she continued to have a heart that desired to be there for others. And so, I don't know. When I read this, it just makes me think, do we care for people enough that it's made a difference in their lives? I want you to think about that for yourself. You know, it's easy to look at what other people do for us and judge whether they care or not. But what about how we care for others? Do we care enough that it makes a difference in how they care? You know, it amazes me sometimes that some of the people that have cared for me in times that I really needed it were some of the most unlikely people that I thought would. But it made me realize that I need to care about everyone, because everyone needs someone to care for them, right? I mean, just because somebody's having a hard time and they're not very nice doesn't mean that they don't need someone to care for them, right? I don't know these people that were poor and had all these needs, but I imagine that they probably were not perfect people. I'm sure they had bad days. I'm sure that there were things that frustrated them, right? I know being poor can be difficult. But I also know that when people care about your needs, it does something to your heart. Now, you got to understand, Dorcas could not take care of every one of their needs, right? But she was able to take care of a few of their needs. You may feel like there's nothing that you can do to help anyone, but I don't think that's true. We all can do something to help one another. And because of that, we've got to at least try, right? So, when we care, it can persuade other people to care, okay? So, sometimes it could be your time. Maybe you don't have a lot of resources, but you got a little bit more time than you have resources. Maybe you got resources and you don't have a lot of time, but either way, you can use what you have, right? Or maybe it's just kind words. Maybe you don't have much of either one of those, but you got a way that you can say, you know what, I can encourage them, right? So use what you have. Don't just think that you can't do anything. You can do something. And whatever you do can be remembered as something that is positive, right? So, my final point today is if we want great things, then we need to be convinced of God's greatness. If we want great things, then we need to be convinced of God's greatness. We need to understand about God's greatness, right? We need to realize the truth of God's greatness. We need to be persuaded of God's greatness. Okay? So I'm going to read here as we keep going in Acts, and I'm going to keep reading in verse 40. Chapter 9, verse 40. It says, "But Peter asked them all to leave the room. Then he knelt and prayed. Turning to the body, he said, 'Get up, Tabitha.' And she opened her eyes. When she saw Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then he called the widows and all the believers, and he presented her to them alive." Wow. The news spread throughout the whole town, and many believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed a long time in Joppa, living with Simon, a tanner of hides. Okay? Now, I don't know if that means he liked to give people whippings. No, I'm just teasing. Sorry, sometimes my jokes are not very good. I know dad jokes, my kids always say, Dad, you got too many dad jokes. I'm like, well, you made me a dad, so it's your fault. So either way. So if we want great things, then we need to be convinced of God's greatness. You see, who is convinced of God's greatness? There's different people here that were convinced. You understand? First, the people who cared for Tabitha was convinced that Peter, under the power of God, could bring her back to life. They were convinced that that could happen, or they wouldn't have spent the time to go get him. Right? How many times do we think, oh, wouldn't that be nice if, but we don't go to make it happen? Right? We just think, oh, that'd be nice, Lord. Yeah, that'd be nice, but how much are you convinced that it's going to happen? Are you convinced enough to go after whatever it is that you thought would be nice? So the people that cared for Lydia was convinced of God's greatness, weren't they? Not only them, but Peter was convinced of God's greatness, right? Because they went after him and they told him to come. You know, what if he said, you know what, she's already dead. She's already dead. I've got other things to do. She's already dead. Peter didn't do that. You know what he did? He went with him. And they brought him to where Tabitha was at. And he had the faith, and he was convinced that if he asked God to bring her back to life, that he would. And that's what happened. But that's not the end of the story. After the people that were convinced that Peter could heal through the power of God, and after Peter was convinced that God could heal her, then after she was healed, guess what happened? Other people were convinced of God's greatness because they knew that Tabitha, aka Dorcas, was dead. Right? They knew that she had died, and guys, let me tell you, it's not a good diagnosis when the doctor says you're dead. Right? You probably don't even know he said it because you're dead. Right? I mean, it's like, okay, you're gone. But at that point, you see, when God does something like that to someone that you know and you love, it changes your perspective. It changes the way that you think about things that are true. You know, normally they would probably think, well, I know she's dead. That's true. But God changed the reality of what they thought was possible. Right? Because God began to recalibrate their minds into thinking that God can raise people back to life. Right? How awesome would that be if that was somebody you loved that God brought back to life? You'd be like, what? Adam, I'm sure for a time you'd be like, we've watched too many weird movies. Okay? You know, I say we, but I'm sure you guys have too. I mean, you could even watch a commercial now. It's like everything's like zombies and everything's like, I don't like zombies, but either way, you know, it's like, okay, is she a zombie, you know? No, you know what? God can bring her back to life, and he can bring her back the way she was. Normal. But things would not be the same. Right? Things would not be the same because God did a miracle. And once God does a miracle in your life, it changes you. In a good way. Because then you begin to broaden your idea of what God can do. And you begin to have more faith in greater possibilities that God can do, right? So, when people realize what God can do, it can change them. Guys, has God changed you? Has God ever changed you and your perspective on things throughout your life? Maybe it was because some of the encounters that you had with God, right? Well, the more encounters that we have with God, the more it changes us. If you want to be changed, then seek Him and you'll find Him. And when you find Him, He will renew you and change you. And when we care, it can persuade other people to care, you know? I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but that's the way it happens a lot, right? So you know, people, they're like, well, you know, I just think Christians should be like this. Okay, then won't you be one that's like that? Won't you be one that's like that? You know, instead of putting different stipulations on others rather than yourself. Right? Why don't you be one that cares? Why don't you be one that is a model of who God is? Why don't you try to be like Him? I think we all need to try to be more like Jesus. What do you think? I mean, it's a constant thing. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant moving toward what we know we need to do. But if we want to see miracles, if we want to see great things in our lives, then we need to be convinced that it can happen. Right? Convinced to understand that it can happen, to realize the truth of what can happen, and to be persuaded, fully persuaded. You know, there's a scripture that gives me a little bit more hope. When there's the dad that had his child that needed healed, right? And the dad said, Jesus said, do you believe? And he said, I do believe. Well, help my unbelief. You know what that's saying? It's saying that even though we may not be fully convinced, walking in obedience is still important, right? Because you have to have some faith in order to continue in obedience, right? But when you stop walking in obedience, the devil gets victory, because you may say you have faith, but your faith is not in action. And it's faith in action that is able to produce miracles. You see, if that dad did not have enough faith to go to seek a healing for his son, then his son would not have been healed. Even though it didn't happen the first time, he still continued to seek the healing. You see, many times we get frustrated when it doesn't happen when and how we want it to happen. You know what the problem is with that? We're not God. That's right. We're not God, and just because we think things should be a certain way or be done a certain way or whatever, doesn't mean that's the way it's going to happen. But we've got to trust that God knows what needs to happen. And as we seek Him, we can encounter His presence if we continue with faith, convinced in what He can do. So, let me ask you this today. How convinced are you of what God can do? Is there any doubt in your mind of the miracles that you need? If there is, ask God to remove those doubts and place more confidence in His Word, in His actions, in His ability, and in His love. Could you imagine what would happen if we all made a commitment of further trust in God today? You know, it's your choice. It's your choice what you do. I mean, God's not going to make you trust Him. He's not. He's not going to make you serve Him. He's not going to make you love Him. He's not. That's not the personality of God. That's not who He is, right? But when we do, it changes things. And it may not happen overnight. But as we continue in trusting in the Lord, we will see awesome and wonderful things. So, here's an opportunity. The altars are open. Here's an opportunity for you to experience more confidence